Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks a lot for joining us for this RE 2019 learning event. My name is Roxana Sami, and I have the pleasure and honor of moderating the session this afternoon. I wanted to welcome our ICO colleagues from Azerbaijan, Brazil, Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Peru. And to the Kenyan ones, a very warm welcome. I miss you guys. I also want to welcome everybody who is joining us via webcast, and also the students in the room from Johns Hopkins, John Cabot, the European School of Economics, and our member states. Thank you very much for making time to be with us this afternoon. We do look forward to a very interactive event and allowing both those people in the room and also outside to really engage in a very candid and honest and frank conversation. The hashtag for the event is 2019 ARI. We'll also be using a piece of technology which is called Mentimeter. So I'm not going to ask you to switch off your phones because you actually need your phones to use Mentimeter. So I'm going to ask you to pull out your phones, please, and go to your browser, type in menti.com, and once you're there, there is a code you need to enter, and the code is 383511. So you type that in, and then you can pose a question. Just type anything just so that we test the technology, because what will happen during the event is that you're going to be using Mentimeter to pose your questions, your comments, your observations. And everybody will be seeing it live on the screen, and Nora will also be monitoring it. And if there's any, we can then ask the salient questions to the various panelists. But what is important is that we can save all of your comments and questions so that then, the Independent Office of Evaluation can take them into account. So if you don't mind, can we just test the technology just to make sure everything is okay? So pull out your phones. This is probably the only time you can use your phones in a meeting. Okay, while you're doing that, we have a packed agenda for today. So we're going to have a presentation. Chitra will give us a presentation about the ARI, and then we'll move to the panel discussion. Now, before doing all of that, if I may please ask Oscar to give a welcoming remark, and then we'll kick it off with the presentation. Oscar.
Thank you very much, Roxy. Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm really delighted to have you among us in this learning event on the annual report on results and impact of IFAD operations, the ARI, which, as you know, is IOE's flagship report. This is the 17th edition of the ARI. IOE has been presenting the ARI since 2003, and I would like to also welcome some representatives from our executive board, as well as the Associate Vice President, Donald Brown, who honors us with his presence and who represents management perspective in this event. As Roxy was saying, we will have a very interactive session with a panel that will be able to delve more deeper into the content of this year's ARI. But before doing so, allow me to just highlight a few points about the nature of this report. The ARI is a synthesis report based on a sample of evaluation that have been conducted in IFAD since 2002, and therefore it constitutes a database that grows every year with the new batch of evaluations that were conducted the year before. It comprises right now with a sample of 344 independent evaluations. As you know, evaluations rate the performance of IFAD across evaluation criteria such as relevance, effectiveness, efficiency, sustainability of benefits, which are the typical OECD DAC criteria for development effectiveness. But in addition to that, over the course of the years, IFAD has adapted also some areas that are important for its business model. We wouldn't be able to fulfill our mission without knowing how are we doing in terms of gender equality and women's empowerment. How are we doing in terms of natural resource management and helping smallholder farmers to adapt to climate change? Or how are we doing in terms of innovation? IFAD should bring to the field innovation in every operation that it finances. And are those innovations susceptible of being scaled up? How do we do on scaling up? And therefore, IOE has added a few dimensions like this ones, and therefore the ARI collects a sample of evaluation ratings, and so far we have 3,807 ratings, which constitute an interesting database that can really help us identify some trends in performance. Therefore, every year, the database is enlarged by the new sample of evaluations that were conducted, in this case during 2018. And we present some learning themes that try to explain what is leading performance, or what are the topics that we need to discuss to understand better the levels and the trends about performance. In that sense, Chitra will make a presentation also about the learning theme for this edition of the ARI. I would like to highlight that the level of performance that you see today reflects, in my view, in a very interesting way, the transformational changes that the institution is going through. IFAD's strategic framework for the period 2016 to 2025 envisions IFAD fulfilling its mandate of reducing rural poverty by working in a way that is bigger, better, and smarter. Last year, management introduced many new policies and strategies, which have laid the foundation for IFAD's proposed pathway to contribute to meeting our ambitious projects achievement during the 11 replenishment period and beyond, which of course includes our commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This year's edition of the ARI highlights that reaching the ambitious SDG, namely ending poverty and hunger, as well as achieving gender equality, requires commensurate resources and capacities within IFAD and its partner countries. In particular, to perform better, we will need to, first, dedicate more resources directly to country program delivery to achieve improved development outcomes. Secondly, design programs according to the country context and adjusting them to the main relevant to the country context and capacities. And thirdly, develop government capacities to design and implement our programs. Today's events provided us an opportunity to bring together IFAD Executive Board members, management, staff, and colleagues from the Rome-based agencies, as well as our country offices, to discuss and reflect a bit upon the challenges that we have, the lessons learned, and how can we move forward from here. We hope that through these lessons, we may also generate concrete actions that can be taken forward to achieve the transformational change that we are all aiming. I would like to conclude by thanking a team of colleagues who have dedicated themselves very ably and full-heartedly to develop the ARI, and those were led by Chitra Deshpande to my left, by Willem Sijip, who helped us with the learning theme, Valentina Di Marco and Mankan Kane with the statistical analysis, and Jacqueline Souza with the communications efforts. And nowadays, the ARI for IOE constitutes really the basis of a knowledge management system, because the knowledge that is embedded in that database can inform various others evaluations at project and country level, as well as thematic and cluster project evaluations. So we are very proud to be sharing the lessons of this, and I thank you very much for your attention. I do look forward to a fruitful and active participation also through the new technology provided by Mentimeter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oscar. Thank you for the warm welcome, the invitation to have an open discussion, and underscoring the let's say the magnitude and the depth and breadth of the ARI database. So may I now ask Chitra to give the presentation. Chitra's presentation will really set the context for the conversation that will follow.
Thank you, Roxy. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is truly a pleasure for me to present highlights from the 2019 ARI. Overall, the majority of IOE ratings are positive between 2007 and 2017. However, performance trends between 2007, performance trends over the last 5 years show flat or declining. Recently, performance in traditional areas of strength, such as IFAD performance as a partner and rural poverty impact, have shown decline. Compared to other international financial institutions' agricultural portfolios, IFAD's project performance is better than the African and Asian development banks. However, it is now lower than the World Bank's globally, as well as in Latin America and the Near East, North Africa, and Europe regions. Notably, the World Bank, unlike IFAD and the others, does not include sustainability of benefits in its definition of project performance. In relation to IFAD's 10th replenishment results measurement framework commitments, only the target for adaptation to climate change was met based on both management and IOE's ratings by completion date. Based on IOE's ratings, the targets for environment and natural resources management and innovation, highlighted in blue, were 10 percentage points within reach. In contrast, scaling up, sustainability of benefits, and efficiency in red were over 20 points below target. Trends in non-lending activities have declined for knowledge management and country-level policy engagement, but improved in partnership building. Positive factors include systematically supporting dialogue, engaging actors beyond the project life, and capitalizing on good practices and lessons. Negative factors include limited resources, capacities, and technical knowledge, as well as the lack of clear country strategy objectives. This year, we included a special chapter which analyzes IFAD's 10th replenishment performance in relation to past replenishments and IFAD's current strategic framework's aim for a bigger, better, and smarter IFAD. In 2008, the global food crisis prompted the exponential growth of IFAD's program of work in IFAD 8, driven by co-financing. Although the program of work declined slightly in IFAD 10, it has remained big. To cope with a larger program, IFAD began designing fewer projects, which increased the median size of approved projects from $45 to $52 million between IFAD 8 and 10. Despite this increase, the number of beneficiaries per project declined in approved projects from 58 to 23 million. As a result, the cost per beneficiary has increased. IFAD also attempted to be smarter by reducing budgeted resources for IFAD country programs. Within IFAD 10 alone, the administrative budget, including staff and non-staff resources, allocated to country program management, design, supervision, and implementation support fell 30% between 2016 and 2018. In relation to the approved program of loans and grants, this budget allocation declined from 9 to 7%. The average total administrative budget allocation per approved project declined 10%. We also saw that the ratio of supervision missions per project declined from 2.1 to 1.7 between IFAD 8 and 10. On a positive note, disbursement lags were shorter, and there were fewer project extensions. However, the projects that completed during IFAD 10 do not show better quality overall. In terms of statistical significance, only environment and natural resources management improved between IFAD 8 and 10. Declining trends are found for most criteria based on IOE's and management's ratings of projects at completion between IFAD 8 and 10. Relevance and IFAD performance as a partner shows statistically significant declines between IFAD 9 and 10. We examined the three criteria with statistically significant changes more closely for lessons. For environment and natural resources management, we found that technical training as well as adopting long-term approaches and preventive measures contributed to positive performance. However, limited budget, the absence of specialists for supervision, and high staff turnover contributed to the recent downturn in IFAD performance as a partner. The decline in relevance is marked by a steady erosion in satisfactory or better ratings due to ambitious project design, weak targeting, and insufficient context analysis. This decline in relevance confirms the timeliness of the 2019 learning theme. Since 2017, IFAD has defined relevance as the extent to which project objectives are consistent with beneficiaries' requirements, country needs, institutional priorities, and policies. Project design, coherence, and targeting strategies are also assessed. To better understand relevance in IFAD projects, we examined 34 projects that underwent both a quality assurance review and independent evaluation. We then focused on 6 project case studies, from which we derived the following 5 lessons. The first lesson is that continued relevance requires adapting the project design throughout implementation. Relevance is not a fixed assessment of whether or not an initial project design is consistent with country priorities and policies. Relevance needs to be revisited throughout the project life to allow for responsive and appropriate adaptations to maximize the impact on the lives of the rural poor. The second lesson is that project relevance is enhanced by engaging beneficiaries meaningfully in its design, implementation, and evaluation. A better understanding of the needs and options of beneficiaries is achieved through intensive consultation. Good targeting strategies are then developed and should clearly respond to the questions: who are the poor? Why are they poor? What are we going to do, and how will we do it? Lesson 3 is that government commitment is critical in adopting pro-poor policies, in providing adequate implementation capacity, and ensuring continued relevance during and after the project's lifespan. In fact, project performance as a partner, government performance as a partner is one of the key criteria which accounts for overall performance of IFAD projects. Lesson 4 is that limited implementation capacities and a lack of understanding of institutional arrangements can impede the relevance of even the best design. The limitations can be addressed by longer-term engagement with select borrowers, continued and decentralized government ownership during implementation, and timely support from IFAD staff and technical advisors. Lesson 5 is that well-functioning institutions are a key determinant of higher relevance. Insufficient understanding of institutions leads to implementation issues. Therefore, solid institutional analysis is required for all designs. To conclude, the 2019 ARI finds that IFAD has set very high ambitions commensurate with the 2030 Agenda commitments to be bigger, better, and smarter. To perform better, IFAD needs to dedicate more resources to project design, supervision, and implementation support. Design IFAD programs based on country capacities and ensure implementation arrangements are appropriate. Develop government capacities to design and implement country programs in collaboration with other partners. Determine earlier the need to adjust project designs to ensure continued relevance, and devise a more comprehensive and coherent system to better mitigate risks. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Chitra, and thank you for setting the context for the panel discussion that will follow, how to improve the quality of IFAD operations for better results. So may I now ask the panelists to take their seats. So let's start in alphabetical order. Margarita Astralaga, who is our Director of Environment, Climate, Gender, Social Inclusion, and Fabrizio Felloni, the Deputy Director of the Independent Office of Evaluation, Sarah Mabago Bunu, I hope I pronounced that right, Regional Director of East and Southern Africa, and Ashwani Mutu, the Director of Quality Assurance Group. Okay, well, thanks a lot for accepting to be our panelists today. Chitra's presentation just outlined that IFAD aims to achieve its mandate by reducing rural poverty and contribute to achieving the SDGs by becoming bigger, better, and smarter, and this is part of the strategic framework. Now, to achieve these goals, IFAD has also set ambitious targets in its 11th replenishment, such as 90% of completed projects receiving positive rating for the overall project achievement by 2021. Yet, from what emerged from the ARI, what we're seeing is that there is a flat and declining trend in both IOE and PMD ratings. So the purpose of this panel discussion and exchange is to understand how we should interpret these results. What is it that we can do to address them? I ask all of you in answering your questions to keep your questions to your answers to 3 minutes, and I will be exercising the prerogative of the moderator, although I'm sure I don't need to do that. So let's start with Margarita. So Margarita, the 2019 ARI shows that on the natural resource management front, IFAD's performance has improved significantly compared to IFAD 8. And the analysis attributes this success to the availability of technical expertise and long-term strategies. Could you walk us through how did you guys manage to do this, and how can others learn from this experience and the steps to put in place to further improve the results in this area?
Thank you, Roxy, and good afternoon, everyone. I think that is the ARI made a very good analysis on the why. And the first step, of course, was establishing of the Environment and Climate Division in 2010. Already as a group that was supporting the GEF access to supplementary funds, the small unit in the Policy and Technical Advisory Division was trying its best to really ensure that all IFAD investments had a component of environment and climate. But establishing the division, of course, gave that very important strength with a group of very well-prepared technical experts on the subject. I would say that was the first ingredient. The second ingredient was the ability to access additional funding. Obviously, ASAP, the adaptation for a smallholder agriculture program, had a huge influence on how IFAD was designing its projects. The other element, the third element, I would say, is the environment and climate assessment-related policies. So we started in 2015, but in fact, since 2004 and 2006, IFAD started looking into the environment and climate issues of the projects, not in such detail, but at least from the SECAP adoption in 2014, systematically, we started looking at every design and at every implementation report. So taking into account all these elements allow us to be more strategic, both in the design of the COSOPs, taking into account all the elements, and we moved from the do no harm that we used to be doing before to do good, to identify opportunities where we can do better. Also, through the SECAP, we started being able to identify sensitive ecosystems to make sure that we would not produce any damage into those ecosystems. We were also looking into how to train and how to increase public awareness of the importance of environmental management. and also working with local communities in a participatory basis. So even with communities that are illiterate, we started developing plans where they could do their local planning through maps, through talking maps that could identify their priorities and the best way to conserve those resources. So I think we went through several areas, but working with the local communities, the bottom-up approach is key, and obviously our government counterparts. Because if our PMUs, our program management units on the ground, don't understand why environmental sustainability and climate adaptation are important, then we will not get very far. So it's also the training in-house, increasing the public awareness of our own colleagues and ourselves to understand that the sustainability of IFAD projects on the ground depends also on environmental sustainability and climate adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Margarita. I think you touched on a number of points. One, that to have this dedicated division, the additional funding that came, and also, the crux, which is like, the participatory way of working and having, the right skills, both at government level and also at staff level. Okay, very good. Now over to Sarah. You just heard Margarita talking about her success and the journey that, that they went through. Now, in terms of the IFAD performance as a partner, both the 2019 ARI and PMD ratings showed that the performance of the organization has declined since IFAD 8. So from where you sit, and I understand, you are new in the job, but what do you think is the cause of this decline, and what is PMD doing to reverse and improve on this trend?
Thank you, Roxy, and fellow panelists. Good afternoon, participants. Thank you for the question. I think it's one of those hot seat questions. So I will try and respond with a little bit of pushback. Having looked at the slides that were presented by Chitra, I don't know if we can put them up a bit. There has been a table that was presented there that did highlight that there wasn't consistent decline over the same period. So IFAD 8, IFAD 9, IFAD 10. We see actually that under IFAD 9, there was actually a peak in performance, if you look at it, which was quite interesting to see, and then a very small sort of minor decline in IFAD under IFAD 10. So, and another point that I'd like to perhaps put on the table, and you can address a little bit later, is the statistics that were used in the different periods. Now, under IFAD 10, there was mainly 35 projects which were assessed, and this was statistically much smaller than the number of projects which were assessed under IFAD 9 and IFAD 8. So there again, it would be interesting to delve deeper into that to see what would be the difference if they actually stuck to the same statistical assumptions. And finally, related to what the report is saying, and just to clarify, it seems that we have been rated fairly strongly around partnerships at the local level. So this, I think, is consistent. But if we're rated positively for building partnerships at local levels, it's also quite strange that we then find that there's high turnover of staff, and the engagement is lower. So there's some aspects that I think need to be further edged out. We have improved in co-financing as IFAD. We are a trusted partner by government. That's what the report says. In fact, a preferred partner. All of this cannot be in direct contradiction with the sort of high turnover in staff, and perhaps it needs to be nuanced. Perhaps there has been an impact at the project management unit level, and not necessarily in IFAD's overall engagement with government. But having said all that, I think there are a number of very key things that we're already doing as IFAD to address and ensure that our performance remains very steady. So we are really looking at designs, relevance, how can we make our designs more relevant? There was already questions around looking at institutional capacities. So in our design missions, we're actually going in. We have boosted our strength around procurement, around fiduciary, basically FM analysis of potential partners on the ground at design, also procurement analysis of country systems, but also of other actors there. We are really inviting government to come up with their own concept notes. So this is what triggers a design mission. So from the onset, we are bringing them in to own the processes. And I would also just like to say that in our evaluations, for instance, the Mopan evaluation that was done in April this year, it sort of speaks to some of these results. And just to bring your attention to that, it does really suggest that IFAD's operations are impactful. We are having results in NRM because of the investments we made, so that's really coming out very clearly. And innovation is key for us. So it's also useful, I would say, to triangulate some of these studies with other study partners to have a more balanced impression of our performance. So I would like to just stop there.
Okay, thank you. Let me just ask you a follow-up question. So you said that you have started, we're asking governments to do their own concept notes, and then you're also trying to reduce the turnover within the PMUs and what have you. So what has been the results so far?
Well, we have very good examples. I think in the past there was one or two occasions where the countries actually at the very last minute had refused certain designs. And then we were all sort of surprised, which demonstrated that maybe there wasn't some level of consultation that was anticipated. Now we insist that they develop multi-sector, multi-ministry teams. Before we go in, they send us a financing request and they share an outline of what they want to do. This already precludes that they have ownership and they've highlighted the areas that they want. The second thing we always recommend from them now on is to say, okay, who's the lead ministry and what systems do you put in place for implementing this project? We encourage them to try and get single delivery units. This is looking like a good practice because then the projects can share examples and experiences. They can also share the FM costs, the procurement costs, M&E costs that sort of run across the projects. So we're seeing all that coming in. If I look at the East and Southern Africa division now, we have quite a heavy portfolio of 49 ongoing projects, 3.5 billion. Roughly, we have revisited how we are doing supervision. So we have supervision implementation support missions. We have, and these are followed up, especially if there's a problem at risk. This is listed out in all of our data systems. We're able to be proactive towards that. So we're really seeing positive trends around improvements. We've cut down, for instance, from problem projects that we had to just about 3 or 4. So these are all positive trends.
Wonderful. So then we all look forward to a very upward trend in the next edition of AVI. So Fabrizio, the Independent Office of Evaluation undertakes different types of evaluation, one of them being the corporate level evaluations. Now in 2018, IOE led the corporate level evaluation on poor value chains. And it's interesting to note that then the majority of the projects that were completed recently, including during IFAD 10, were market access or value chain projects. So if you can just share with us, having led that CLE, how do you think this shift towards value chain projects affected IFAD's overall project performance? And what is it that we can learn collectively from this experience?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. A very interesting question. When we conducted the corporate level evaluation on value chain, IFAD's support to Propur value chain, which is now available, so you can find the report online, we had at the time, it was 2018, a number of projects. First, let's say, earlier generation cohorts of projects which dealt with value chain support. So we compared those projects with projects within the same generation that did not have value chain support, with and without value chain, you can say. What we did find is that, if you look at the ratings in terms of evaluation criteria of IFAD, the ratings for the project with value chain support were only slightly higher on average than the other, was only slightly higher. But when we checked for statistical significance, it was mostly non-significant. So small difference, not yet statistical significant. You can interpret it in many ways. It may be because it was the number of the sample is still small. It might be because these were the old, sort of the first generation of projects, so we didn't have much experience, so the difference was not that strong. And I think we may want to rerun this exercise maybe at the end of the next year when we have a larger population of projects. But from a substantive point of view, what we did find is that IFAD embarked on a major reconfiguration and let's say revision of its project design. So if you look at projects which were designed 10, 15 years ago with the ones that have been designed more recently, on value chain you really see two different types of projects, and IFAD was not really thinking very much about marketing, was more focused on production, maybe food self-sufficiency, not so much about marketing some 10, 15 years ago, it is now. So the project have really learned, you can see there's been a process of learning. On the other hand, we still found in the evaluation were some issues with the project design, still now. So, for example, there's sometimes a deficit in the analysis of the project on which commodities they should focus on, why, which one would be more beneficial to the poor, and also which phase of the value chain they should concentrate on. Is it processing? Is it, for example, bulking together products? Is it retailing? So that was not always there. Another finding that we end there, and we also at some point were able to map the project performance, the value chain project performance, under two criterion. One was to what extent they were beneficial to the poor and very poor people. The second one, to what extent they managed to upgrade the value chain, so they've been able to have a value chain work better, perform better. And we found a project which did very well on both. So both poor effect and being able to upgrade the value chain. This project has three characteristics. One, they're projects in which were follow-up phases. So IFAD and the government had worked on a certain area for a number of years, for maybe 2 or 3 project phases. So they'd learned about the production milieu, the commodities that the poor farm, smallholder producer could produce. So learning aspects, first of all. The second aspect that looked at the value chain governance, that is the relationship between value chain actors, the producers, the aggregators, the retailers. So they looked at the value chain governance and tried to make it more inclusive, so that farmers were helped in better negotiating prices and sale conditions with aggregators, with buyers. The third aspect, which was common in this project, was that there was also a technical assistance component. So someone with specialized skills in value chain or marketing was there, helping the project management team, because IFAD projects are implemented not by us, they're implemented not by IFAD, they're implemented by governments. The fact of having specialists that are able to translate the project design into concrete actions, what needs to be done, with who are our partners, that was the third key element to this project, both pro-poor and anyway successful in upgrading the value chain. Thanks.
Thank you, Fabrizio. That's an interesting backstory of it. And again, this whole theme of having that specialized skills keeps coming up again and again. Now let's shift gears, and Ashwani, what I want to ask you is, we know about the importance of partnership and good project design, and we also know that for governments, they are an important partner in the good implementation of the projects. The RE Learning theme for this edition highlighted the importance of government commitment, beneficiary engagement, and institutional analysis. So my question to you is, how can QUAG, the process that you are leading, ensure that these factors are addressed at project design?
Thank you very much. Let me preface my remarks by saying that IFAD does a lot during implementation to strengthen government commitment, beneficiary engagement. But I will limit my intervention only to project design, what my group does in ensuring government commitment, beneficiary engagement, and institutional analysis at design, at the time of project design. So now in terms of government commitment, what we look at in projects at the design stage is to see first and foremost the level of ownership of government and whether they have actually been involved throughout the design process, in conceptualizing the design and in accompanying the project development process. That's the first thing. The second thing we look at, and just to be concrete, is to see to what extent governments are providing counterpart funding as part of the overall project costs, because that is a reflection of their commitment as well to the operation. And depending on the per capita income of the country, you would expect greater counterpart funding allocations as countries move up the ladder from low-income countries to middle-income countries and upper middle-income countries. The third dimension that we look at is at design whether there is a robust exit strategy, because that would be also a further reflection of government's commitment to take on what is still required at the time of completion in terms of providing any recurrent costs, but also keeping in place the necessary institutional arrangements to ensure sustainability of benefits. And finally, on government commitment, also to see in design, particularly because at the time of design, we also look at the project implementation manual, the draft, and also the first annual work plan and budget to see to what extent government is committed to deploying staff to the project management unit. You know, the right type of technical expertise with the required seniority, preferably also to what extent government agrees to competitive recruitment processes to staff the project management units. Now, on beneficiary engagement, again, similarly, we want to see in design to what extent beneficiaries at the household level, but also through their organizations at the community level, they're involved in the design process. Plus, in particular, we want to see to what extent design is responsive to the needs of the different segments of target groups that we will be working with, whether it's women, whether it's youth, whether it's people with disability, and so on. And finally, on institutional analysis, what we do in design is to see to what extent the institutional analysis that has been undertaken responds into the right type of institutional architecture for implementing the project. Whether it is government institutions, which government institutions, and depending on the nature of the governance in the country, to what extent federal ministries are involved, to what extent institutions at the state or provincial level also engaged. Depending on the type of project, we try to see whether the private sector has been mobilized, to what extent community organizations are involved, and so on. So I think I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwani. Thank you. And it is reassuring to hear that we are keeping an eye on making sure that the projects are sustainable once they are done and dusted. Okay, there are lots of questions coming here. I'll come back to these, but what I want to do is just one other question to the panel before going to the floor and also to the questions that are coming online. Now, one of the many things that we strive as development workers is to make sure that the interventions are relevant and sustainable, and they're relevant for the people we work with and we serve, and they're sustainable. Now, Chitra in her presentation mentioned that IFAD's interventions need to maintain their continued relevance from start to finish. Given the panel's different perspective of project design and implementation, I want to ask you, how can we improve the relevance of IFAD interventions, and what are some of the concrete actions your divisions will be taking, or have already undertaken, or will be undertaking? Now, Ashwani, I'm going to start with you, and if you could just talk about what is it that your division will do in terms of project design and quality at entry.
Together with PMD and SKD, we're currently doing a review and taking stock of the implementation of the revised design process, which was adopted in the middle of last year. And as part of that process, we're revising the development effectiveness matrix, which provides a series of indicators to assess project quality at entry. So that's a concrete thing that we're doing. And alongside the revision or improvement, further development of the development effectiveness matrix, we're also trying to see how the peer review process that we have during design can also be further strengthened so that the peer reviewers, when they're reviewing design documents, can actually contribute to enhancing quality in general. That's the first thing. The second thing I want to speak about, and then I can stop, is that within QUAG itself, as you might know, we rate projects at entry once the design has been completed. So we are in QUAG revisiting the rating criteria that we apply to assess the quality of, at entry. But not only the rating criteria, we're also looking at a process to strengthen consistency in ratings across projects at entry, which will include also a dialogue, I believe, with PMD, which wasn't happening in the past. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Ashwani, just a follow-up question to you. What are some of the challenges that you foresee, if any, in implementing these three things that you mentioned?
I think it's the challenge that the whole institution is facing, which is, on one hand, the need to deliver the largest program of loans and grants in our history, while at the same time introducing these changes for improvements.
Okay, but if you have to do it, you have to introduce the changes. So I'm not quite sure I understand what is where is the challenge?
Well, you see, on one hand, we have to deliver our core business of doing the reviews and continue doing that. So the challenge will be the need to find space and time and the resources to be able to do these revisions.
Very good. So space, time, and resources. Yes. This is the eternal dilemma. Margherita, to you, if you can talk about in terms of poverty targeting, how can we make IFAD projects more relevant in terms of poverty targeting?
Roxy, why did you change my question? I thought it was the same one.
It is the same one, but it's a different angle.
No, I'm just joking. But no, I think that it links also to some of the questions there and to some of the things Ashwani just said on the targeting. Because, as you know, during this period of IFAD 11, IFAD committed to big things. One was to ensure that 100% of women are taken into account when we are designing our projects, but that we would ensure there is a transformational approach to 25% in all IFAD projects. So it means that we are sort of stepping up our level of ambition, and that is why in the case of gender is because we know it's not enough to guarantee or to aim for 50% of the beneficiaries to be women, but it's to ensure that their life is transformed after we leave. So that is now our commitment to 25%. Then on the youth agenda, again, we committed that 50% of IFAD's projects will focus on youth or will take into account the youth situation. So with these commitments and the integrational framework that is asking us to look for synergies, what we have done through the targeting guidelines, which were just approved by the board in September, is to try to define, to have a common understanding of what we mean by the poor, the poorest, the most vulnerable people. And also to find the best ways to measure that. Because some of the issues we have discussed, and I think one of the questions here, why is it that we see gender declining, for example? One of the elements that is key in this discussion is the definitions, the clarity, how we ensure that all of us are talking about the same thing. And there is, of course, there is always subjectivity, but the problem is how do we make this more objective? So that is what we are trying to do with the targeting guidelines that need to be applied almost immediately, by recognizing basically the fact that poverty is very different from country to country, and even in every country from region to region. So it's very context specific, the measures you have to take to really ensure you are targeting the right people. Then you also have to align your targeting approach according to the country legislation. So it's not enough. If we understand that poverty is somebody who makes more than less than $1 a day, and the government considers that somebody who makes $5 a day is poor, then we have to adapt to the national legislation and not make our own definitions of who is the poor or the poorest in the country, because it's very different from country to country. And then basically adopting also a consultative approach. We had a lot of discussions here with the board and with colleagues on the self-targeting, because some board members were concerned from the developing world, were concerned that if we sit with the communities and target with the communities, they themselves will leave out some key people in the targeting, because there is discrimination everywhere, and we have to be very careful to have very objective assessments on who are really the poor people, who are the ones that have the most need, and how IFAD's interventions can really help those people. We also agreed that not necessarily the support has to be directly to those, but what we have to guarantee is that everything we do will, at the end of the day, help them, all those people in the poorest areas and the most vulnerable. So that is now, I think, a change of mindset that will ensure that we are really targeting and doing the best we can for the most vulnerable people in rural areas. So that is part of what we are trying to do, but obviously is with all the divisions and the whole IFAD that we will be able to really implement all those action plans as well as the targeting guidelines.
So just on the targeting guidelines, and with the understanding that poverty is multidimensional and your challenges are also multidimensional, how are you going to be taking the show on the road regarding raising awareness about IFAD targeting policy in country with governments?
Well, our first step is to make sure that our own IFAD colleagues in the field are aware of it. So that's why Friday, in a week's time, we will have a full day of training during our global retreat, when all our colleagues from the field, from PMI, PMD, and SKD will be in town, so that we really go deeper into at least having a clear understanding of the commitments that we have made. And then we are also participating in all the regional retreats, and we are starting to do training in the startup workshops to make sure that we are increasing the level of understanding and knowledge. Because I think, as Fabricio said, the implementation at the end of the day is the responsibility of the countries, of the government officials that will be in charge. So if we don't make them understand what the issues are, then of course we will not make much progress, even if we have the best policies and guidelines that we can have.
Absolutely. And as a partner, they also have to understand what is our definition.
Exactly.
And so then you're all singing from the same song sheet. Yeah, okay. So Sarah, to you, if you could answer the question on relevance in terms of government commitment. So what are you going to do to enhance the government commitment to make the projects more relevant?
Actually, before I come to that specific question, I think just going back a little bit and looking at our level of ambition in terms of how we set our own targets is also very important, because these should be, normally should be informed by baselines. And so it would give us a picture to say, you know, if we set a 90% target, is that realistic or not? What is that relating to? So as you said, aptly, there's many differences in different countries, and setting these targets should be more informed. So I think the level of ambition and the way we do target setting, we are revising that. So that's one concrete thing, so not being over-ambitious. The second thing is M&E. There was quite a push at some point when we were talking about MDGs to measure, and governments are trying to build their capacity to do that measurement. We have the SDG Agenda 2030, and there is a data gap. And many governments now are requesting that support. We do have Avantis, the Prime, that is trying to build up their capacity so they can actually understand their face of poverty, people who are sliding in and out of poverty, and also have a better understanding of how the projects are performing in real time. So that's the second area that we're really looking at, using and more modern tools, building up databases that will give us more real-time information around what's actually happening at the beneficiary space and what could be improved. And that then feeds into government processes. What is interesting at government level, they are taking loans, so they do want to see a return on that investment. I find in the dialogues that I'm having with the ministers of agriculture, ministers of finance, they're very clear about the expectations that they want for whether it's reflows, whether it's a return on income, whether it is jobs, whether there's other sort of social dimensions. And as we go forward, we're talking more about agri-food systems now. And they're also really tasking us to say, how do you get a triple return? So on nutrition, if that's possible and that we can measure that, on incomes, on jobs, particularly with youth. So our designs have to be smarter, as we've been talking. How can they respond at least at two levels, maybe it's climate and nutrition or the jobs agenda, and really develop linkages that were not there before from the sort of sustainability angle. I think as well within IFAD we have to reflect and say, do we define what we mean by sustainability? For instance, if you have a project in nutrition, the sustainability is changes in dietary habits. So you don't have that, you don't get that tomorrow. But that's where you'd want, improved health outcomes. So I think there again we have to be very clear about what our core indicators are and what they're not. When I go into the field, it's always a practice. I invite the Minister of Agriculture to join me, or the Deputy, or the Vice Minister. So we go into the sites, we discuss in the field, we come back and have a debriefing session, and there's clarity around the areas that we need to improve. We have a restructuring policy now in-house, which is very clear, that allows us to restructure our projects and look at opportunities where we can either improve value or make it more relevant, adaptable. So those are tools that we have in-house to do that. Our whole cycle for implementation support has been strengthened. We have ORMs and data systems that really show us we have a very rigorous review process of implementation support mission reports that can identify in advance where there's gaps and where there's problems. So I think overall we're doing very concrete things. We have disclosed these. So any government can go onto our site, they can see the level of transparency that we have created is encouraging, because then that allows them to act if they feel that the project is going awry. We've also improved on our sort of risk assessments, so we have a very clear procurement risk assessments and fiduciary risk assessments that we undertake, and we share this with government, and we give them the opportunity to say, do you think this rating is fine or do you not think so? And finally, we are really moving very quickly into adopting citizen engagement tools, which allows our beneficiaries as well to sort of give their feedback and their perception of impact and transformation. And so this is triangulating what we're doing. This response also goes into government, and all of those new tools, I think, will build more confidence in government. Maybe just finally, a final statement. We have seen in the area and in other reports that there's certain tendency in certain regions where there's weaker institutional capacity, particularly in fragile situations, where government isn't as committed because they simply don't have the institutional administrative capacities in those contexts. And we've seen that particularly strong for Western Central Africa. We encourage teams to design differently, taking into account those capacity gaps that exist.
Right.
So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay, I know there is a question on how can we amend the project as it's ongoing without amending the loan agreement. So I'll address that question to you because you started talking about it and you can wrap it up. Fabrizio, to you, if you could just give us an example of effective actions and lessons from evaluation that can help the projects, have concrete, be more relevant, become more relevant.
First of all, thank you. I would like to go back to the point that Chitra made in a presentation, but also you mentioned, which is the relevance not seen as something as confined to the project design, but as a process which allows a project to continue to be relevant, to become even more relevant during the implementation. It's fundamental because we have a span of life of project 6, 8, sometimes 10 years or even more. So during this time, of course, things can change. And also, many of our projects may be relevant, actually most of them are relevant in terms of the objectives that they want to pursue. Some of the initiatives and activities they have may be imaginative or also innovative, but it's also true that when the project hits the ground, you start seeing that some of the assumptions were perhaps too generous or too optimistic. So that's what we find in our evaluation. What is fundamental is to intervene vigorously and as early as possible, when it is still possible to influence the project redesign. Typically, in the past, this happened at midlife of a project implementation, which was the case of midterm reviews, where really the project design could be reconsidered, updated, revised, or redone completely. The idea instead is that this should be done as soon as possible, not in midlife, not after 4 years, but as soon as possible, as soon as it is found that a component is not performing or is not well designed. So this should happen as soon as possible. What we do find is that IFA now believes also that this should be done as early as possible. When we do talk to members of the supervision missions, they sometimes feel less empowered compared to a midterm review to really get into a redesign of a project, and instead sometimes do it after 1 year or 2 years, when it's already clear that it cannot be implemented as it was designed. It can really turn around the project sorts. And this is in general what we find, and I think it's also really the sense of what this year special learning theme of the ARI is saying.
Thank you. Okay, there are lots of questions. I just wanted to check something with Chitra. Chitra, if we don't manage to answer all these questions, can I commit you to answer them and share the responses?
Sure, I'd like to answer some of them.
Sure.
And also some questions that came up.
Sure. But before going to you, may I first ask the ICO colleagues if, can I start off with them? So, ICO colleagues, if you have any questions, you get priority. So just raise your hand so I know who wants to take the floor, and then, and if you're good with everything, then it's good. Then we come back here. You're shy. Okay, you put your question in the Mentimeter. Okay, va bene, that's okay. Very good. Okay. So, Chitra, you want to start us off? Okay.
Well, I'll just clarify a few points. And the first one was Sarah's point about the samples, because I just wanted to clarify that the statistical significance declines were also found in PMD's much larger sample. So we checked that. So it's not just, I think you can't just be limited to the 37. And in fact, the statistical significant declines were also found in project performance according to PMD data. So in terms of data and the findings there, even though our sample was smaller, they're aligned with your data and larger samples, just to clarify that. There was a really good question here about RIA and like the difference between the impact assessments and rural poverty impact. Just to say that these are two different indicators, in fact. Though we call rural poverty impact our indicator there, we're looking at every evaluation. So it's looking at the full sample of completed projects, first of all. And it's an indicator with 4 elements, and those elements are household income and assets, human and social capital and empowerment, food security and agricultural productivity, and institutions and policy, so institution building, which is different from the impact assessment conducted by RIA, which is conducted on a sample of projects, which I think we basically get the results quite later, not immediately after a project is done in an aggregate form. And they were specifically looking at measuring, so they were specifically measuring number of people experiencing economic mobility, number of people with improved production, number of people with improved market access, and number of people with greater resilience, which is so it's a little bit different, shall we say. We're not measuring the human and social capital empowerment, and some of them are similar, but one is based on the projects, the evidence presented in the products, and then the impact assessment is data collected specifically for that. So I think they complement one another, so I wouldn't compare them in that sense of replacing one or the other. I just wanted, there was also clarity on why the improvement in country, partnership in terms of country programs and then IFAD's performance as a partner. Again, these are two different indicators, though partnership is sort of the name. So in terms of the country program, we're really looking at partnerships with government, other, IFIs, other partners, UN partners, things of that nature. Also, there may be grants involved in that. And it's really at the country program level. And that's the difference. And the other is at it's per project, and we're really looking there at what was the monitoring and evaluation, the implementation support, supervision provided operationally to each project. So they are different in their nature. They're also different in their samples. So we do about 5 country programs, and that's the sample per year, with a total of 60 in total. I think I'll just stop there, but if there's anything else.
Can you also talk about
Sure.
there was a question that the ratings are not data. Can you just talk about that? RE just holds the ratings and their data.
Well, I'll just clarify that. I invite you to visit our RE database, and actually, in addition to the ratings that we provide, we also have data. So we have the cost per beneficiary per project based on the total cost at the end of the project, and we include other data points as well. I don't know if it's worth going further into that.
Okay, very good. Thank you for that. So before I want to see in the room if there are any questions from the floor. I know you may have put your question on the Mentimeter, but you can now actually express it in person. Yes. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the good discussion. I just wanted to bring just a thought as a regional director to some of the discussions. I think it's very relevant for all of us to be discussing the issue of quality, because clearly next year we're going to have a portfolio, as Ashwani said, that is perhaps the largest ever, not only in terms of approval, but in terms of ongoing operations. And my impression is that we still have to go a long way on turning around the way we do business if we want quality to improve. My feeling is it's not any longer an issue of templates, guidelines, procedures, etc., but it's an issue on adopting a much stronger client perspective and understanding how the client works. And a lot of the definitions that we discuss here, in my view, do not reflect the reality of how it is perceived by the other side of a business. Let me give you an example. I think on the issue of ownership, in the countries in Western Central Africa where I work, if you think about the Central African Republic, the DRC, they don't have money to put counterpart funding. They don't have money to deploy people as part of the project implementation unit. They don't have a staff and capacity to be part of the design. These were the things that were given here as definition of ownership. It has nothing to do with the perspective of the client. Ownership is working very fast so that you solve a problem that they need to solve immediately, so being agile. It means being able to allow them to have communication strategies that show that the results give them political capacity. So when we think about relevance, in my view, is not only relevance to the problem, which we are, but we need to think about relevance to the client, which ultimately are the ones that steer our results. I don't see that this debate, we usually take it into account. My final point is on another thing that Sarah mentioned, that I fully agree with her, but I wanted to offer one more point, which is on the citizen engagement. Again, it was defined here from the internal perspective as getting feedback from the beneficiaries so that we design a better operation. I don't see any relevance there. A lot of us, like the beneficiaries, have blind spots. So sometimes you don't know what you don't know. We don't really know the solution to your own problem. So I don't think that is a panacea. For me, the citizen engagement matters in countries like the ones I work because they help you strengthen domestic accountability mechanisms so that citizens hold government accountable for results. They go and complain when government is not disbursing. They go and complain when government is misusing the funds. So it's very, very different instrument than actually sitting in a room and asking people what is the solution to their problems. It requires training, it requires redress mechanisms. It's a very different animal. So my plea would be that as we move forward, I think we have exhausted somehow our internal ability to recheck and rechange procedures and things, but let's try to make an effort to understand how when we look at the client, things have a completely different perspective that we can actually affect. Thanks.
Thank you, Lisandro, for that question. Okay, so let Sarah, why don't you take that question and say, what are you doing? Some of the points that Lisandro raised.
Okay, I'll try to give a response to that. Very good observations, of course. Trying to stimulate accountability between citizens and government, I think, is very, very important. It's true that the citizen engagement tools help that to a certain extent. And in many of the East and Southern African countries, which are decentralized in nature, you get much better sort of interaction between the local community, district councils, and beneficiaries in that space. So there we see that there is, where there is that sort of connection, there is strength. Now, our projects, as I said, the M&E systems are there for a reason. Supervision missions like to invite government officials to come along because it's their government. I think all of us have said this, or their projects. So when we design it, we just are saying we are here ready to support you in the areas where you don't have a lot of strength. Where I see that there is quite a lot of change is where there's ownership right at the top, really with the minister. And if the minister is visible as to what the challenges are, then you get a fairly good and strong project. And the project coordinators tend to then listen and take responsibility there. When you don't have ownership of the operation at the highest level, you tend not to have the same thing. But in response as well to Lisandro, I think what is really coming across are the strength of these implementation support units, where you don't have them in countries like the Central African Republic, DRC and so on. It could be very interesting to have that discussion even at the financing agreement and say, how can we be sure to build your strength right at the onset? How are you planning to manage this project if you don't have internal capacity? And perhaps when we design them, there should be that level of commitment to say the minimum you need to have in place is these three things, and if you don't have them, you probably won't have a very successful project. So it's sort of an intuitive type of discussion informed by our understanding of the context, I think.
Thank you. I want to go to Margarita. Margarita, also from where you sit, if you can talk about this ownership, how, and you have some success stories of ownership. So if you could just talk about that.
Thanks, Roxy. For us, of course, I would say that the main ownership is given by the smallholders, because they are the ones that lose everything in the first climate shock there is. Therefore, if they don't need a lot of training, education, public awareness on what, for example, environmental degradation and climate change is, because they feel it every 2 weeks when they lose the only asset that they have, the donkey or the cow or the goat. But I think for us, working through smallholder organizations works much better, because part of the problem, and I was thinking when they were speaking about the fact that we work in many countries where those smallholders don't even have an ID, a national ID. So well enough to think of the citizens, but if they don't vote, they don't exist, they don't count, they have no voice. So we need to help them to have a voice somehow through our empowering and our work on the ground. So to get that ownership, I think it has to come also from it's very important, of course, the top, obviously, but if the bottom is not convinced that that is the way forward, we will not succeed and we will not have sustainability. So we were seeing it, for example, in Bolivia, which was quite amazing. It was the local authorities that took on board. Obviously, we had Evo Morales very convinced because we were working with indigenous communities. We had the Minister of Agriculture also on board. But it was really the local authorities with the local communities really taking ownership, doing everything in the co-financing that also is difficult sometimes to count because how much do you charge per day of the work the indigenous communities are doing to build the irrigation, design the irrigation and building all the ponds that we were building in that project. So I think that is when they see the benefits for them and they see clearly what is the impact, you don't have to worry about ownership. You just have to demonstrate that there is going to be some real benefits directly to them. And also, I think we got ownership from others that were not part of the investment when they started seeing the results in the other places. So also, you get a lot of interest to be part of an investment of IFAD when they see the results elsewhere.
Right. Okay. Yes, sir.
I was sort of a bit puzzled throughout the discussion. I found it quite interesting to see the whole debate on the value chain and how that has added value. But one thing that I'm not clear on is whether you perform any kind of stakeholder analysis at the beginning of the project, how you conduct that, and if you establish a minimum criteria, like let's say we have to have the central government on board, we have to get that other institution on board, and the third one, if we don't get that, we cannot move forward with the project. And if you have a locally supported ongoing process of analysis in order to assure that those conditions don't change radically, and if they do, that you can adjust the scope of the project.
Thank you, sir, for asking the question that I had written down. So I don't need to do that. Okay, who wants to take the stakeholder analysis? Yes, I'll come to you, sir. Just oh, it's on that? Okay, okay, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and thank you for a very stimulating discussion of a project analysis of a very complex nature, particularly when we extrapolate what is happening in the boardroom or in this sort of setting with what is on ground. Definitely, the issue of understanding has to be worked on, and worked on very seriously, because the countries, the smallholders, the policymakers are not in line with what we are talking about here. In fact, what we are doing is like double dutch to them. And the resources are not there. In Africa, these institutions are failing. And with such situation, how do you guarantee that the government will be in a position to give you the expected solid foundation? And if that is not there, nothing is going to happen to make us achieve the purpose for which we are set up. And I think we just have to get some basic things true. Definition, like Lisandro said, has to be well defined. When you talk of IFAD culture, IFAD definition, the people don't understand what you are talking about. So it must be a combined definition or understanding,
right,
so that you can move. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. So Sarah, this is actually, it's very much related. So about the stakeholder analysis and how can we make sure that, yes, the government that you're working with has a solid foundation to then be able to take whatever you're doing and run with it?
No, I think it's a very important question. We have our country's strategic opportunities, what we call COSOP, strategic documents that we undertake, and that's where we bring about all, let's say, stakeholders. We do consultations, and then we bring them together in one space, and we define what the low-hanging fruits would be, what would help agricultural transformation or rural transformation, whether it's on-farm or off-farm, within that country. And we talk to all sorts of people, not only the donor actors, but private sector as well as government, as well as smallholders. So we really bring all the stakeholders together. And it's at that moment that we can actually map and see where are the strengths, who can we partner with, what more will we need to bring on board, and we try to capture that. We still do the same sort of exercise around our projects. So during design, we also try to look at the stakeholders who are there and try to assess capacities and their ability to bring value to the program that we have in place. So there is a sort of a rigorous process which is undertaken, and we look at it from a risk mitigation perspective, and because we're now going into sort of results cost-based budgeting as well, we are picking up a lot more data around where are the weak spots in implementation, where would we face risky situations, and how can we mitigate against that. We don't keep that information to ourselves. We share it in stakeholder forums, and we sign off and we agree. It's true, it's not very easy if you're at the national level and if you're engaged in these national processes and also at decentralized levels to get the commitment that you really need to have. In vast countries, it becomes very difficult, and it's really at decentralized levels that you really have some form of commitment around what the project could bring. But I think ongoing dialogue, we have our governing council, we have our borrowers and our clients coming in there. I think it's not a one-off discussion. We've decentralized. It's our business model as IFAD now. We have quite a lot of team members in what we call hubs. The idea is that we have more frequent engagement with countries. We're also looking at inter-country issues regionally. So for instance, when you look at lakes and how resources are being shared there, or common droughts, common events around spaces, so we bring in one or two governments and have a more collective discussion. So I think we are slowly looking at interesting ways in which we can have more permanent engagement and leadership around what needs to change to meet food security and hunger goals. That's my impression.
Sure.
Hello. Yeah. I would like to add that in cases where our investments are in areas where we have indigenous communities, then we have a more detailed process because we have to undertake the free and prior informed consent from the communities before we finalize the design. And that has to be properly recorded. So we follow that process as part of our safeguards on environment, social, and climate issues, and that is a normal procedure on stakeholder engagement. The other area where we are extremely strict is when there are resettlements. We have to undertake several smallholder stakeholders engagements to make sure that there is not going to be any involuntary resettlement, or that the proposed project will not affect the rights of access to the communities. So we have different levels, and at this time we are precisely at the recent board we discussed a new stakeholder approach for IFAD, because this, as you probably know, is now a condition for all supplementary funds, for GCF, for GEF. So if we want co-financing of these funds, we have to demonstrate that a very detailed stakeholder engagement has taken place. Additionally, stakeholder engagement allows us also to get information in a timely manner of issues that might be affecting the ecosystems or the communities. So that is, I think, part of the process moving forward to ensure that we have those, not necessarily the communities themselves, but sometimes NGOs in the area or other service providers that could be giving IFAD that information in a timely manner.
Thank you, Margarita. Okay, there was an intriguing and interesting question on the Mentimeter where I'm paraphrasing it. It was like, okay, so the ratings have declined. Can this be attributed to the fact that IFAD is raising its bar? So I'm going to go to Ashwani because you see these projects at entry. So are we raising the bar? And if we are, why can't we keep up?
I think surely IFAD is raising the bar. There's a conscious recognition that we rate our projects at entry but also at exit on a 6-point scale, and often we tend to report on performance across different indicators on whether a project for a certain indicator is moderately satisfactory or better. So there is a recognition that we need to disaggregate that reporting to report on projects that are satisfactory and better. So not just moderately satisfactory and better. So there is a recognition that we want to raise the bar in that sense. But now it does take time to make sure projects can actually move to make that jump from moderately satisfactory to satisfactory or better. It's a combination of factors, and I think we're working on that.
Okay, so if we are raising the bar, there was also another question about, the budget is declining. So, and then yet this decline in budget, or lack of budget rather, can result in poor performance. So how are we addressing that?
Yes, I think this is all part of what we're calling smarter operations. What do we put our energies and efforts on during design and supervision? I think that's the question. I don't think there has been evidence yet presented today that suggests that when the budget is increasing that we have better performing projects. So I think it's all around how do we get the right expertise at the right moments that are required by our projects.
So what are you doing to do that?
I think this is really the remit of the regional divisions and the country directors, really looking well in advance when the project units, implementation units, send in their assessment of their own performance. You can easily see the gap of where they should be, where there's low disbursement, and so on. And so I think matching the capacity needs is what is actually going on. And now we have really introduced what we're calling a partial implementation support mission, which is really focused on resolving issues and not just supervising it from a distance. It's really engaging the teams and building their capacity to address a specific challenge. So that's why I'm saying that CDs who are very aware of their portfolios and where the gaps exist, in some other instances we've said, well, the capacities for procurement and adherence to IFAD's international procurement standards are so low, we will bring in temporarily technical assistance in that area so that the project can have a hand-holding, sort of mentoring approach, which has worked quite well, I must say. If I look at the Lesotho example and other examples elsewhere. So it's really tying in the TA to what is needed.
Okay, so because there's also this other question about, how can we change the project during implementation without having to go back and do the loan, an amendment to the loan agreement. And you talked about, that you're putting in place this real-time kind of assessment, and you are restructuring your project. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and the concrete actions that you're putting in place without having to go and amend the loan agreement, which I know it's not an easy one.
The restructuring policy is a new tool that IFAD has introduced, and its restructuring can be level 1 or level 2. Level 2 really is done, let's say it's a lower level restructuring, and the AVP PND has all the responsibility of approving those operations. We have done 3 or 4 of those operations now in restructuring. So we've restructured 2 projects in Zambia, the ongoing portfolio, and 1 in Angola. we're still restructuring a fourth one.
Okay.
And what does it mean? Well, half the time, 50% of the performance of the projects is really linked to the team and the coordination team. And so if they're not performing, really linked to value for money and management, we recommend that we changed. And so we have actually had to, unfortunately, that's not a very good story, but at least change the coordinators, so they've been replaced. We've also looked at how we can strengthen fund flows from the center, Lusaka, all the way to the provinces, and strengthened financial staff as well. And we've also said, well, we are looking at how realistic in terms of the log frames, the results framework, and some of the initial assumptions around the strategies we're using, and we're amending those. And so that is an exercise that usually starts off with a fiduciary portfolio sort of review, and then an identification of where the challenges are, and then in a period of 6 to 8 months, quite rapidly, introducing those systemic changes to have results. So for us, the restructuring policy has been very good because it really enables us to address problem projects in a fairly succinct way and document it so that when the evaluation comes in, they can actually see the restructuring paper and memo and find out what had happened in the project and the actions that we took.
Okay, so Fabrizio, what do you expect from this restructuring?
Actually, what I wanted to say was a follow-up to your question before, which is you came with this sort of scenario of declining resources. Perhaps simplistic response is actually, but there's some budget that need to be protected. Because particularly when you look at all the operations of implementation support, redesign, there's some point where the budget needs to be protected, and going below a certain level might not, with that IFAD might not be able to really provide the support that is needed. I would say from this restructuring, what we would, from an evaluation perspective, would like to see is that it happens relatively fast, relatively early on in the project implementation phase, that it detects immediately what the problems are and takes the courage of changing the design when it is needed. We do sometimes find examples of project design which had a component that could have worked for a number of reasons. We could also found out, for example, that with the best intention, it was not in conformity with implementation capacity at the country level, or even with norms or practices at the country level, for example, procurement practices. So this needs to be addressed as soon as possible, and we hope that with this restructure policy, that would be possible.
I just want to add that we also have a facility for quick project startup. This was also recently introduced, and I think Lisandro and team have made use of it already in Western Central Africa. So it builds in the capacity for governments and project teams to recruit early, to develop their project implementation manuals and avoid all the startup delays that you have. So they can actually draw on the fund fairly early in the process, and then they are able to actually plan in advance. And we found that is also a very useful mechanism in ensuring quality project startup.
Good, very good. Okay, I want to go back to the room just to make sure that to see whether there are any questions. Yes, sir.
I would like to direct my question to Ashwani. Going back to the point that IFAD is sort of raising it bar, I would like to ask if it's not just a change in the methodology which is used in computing this, because I think Sarah made sort of hinted on that. I mean, if you compare the ratings of PMD and IOE, you see some sort of differences. You see these differences even much larger if you compare the variable of relevance. So I mean, perhaps it's not just IFAD raising its bar, but just because of the differences in the methodology which is used in computing, these ratings. Again, Ashwani also made a point that there are some ratings, which are sort of produced during entry. I'd like to know how these ratings are consistent with, what PMD and IOEs come up with at the end of the project.
Thank you for that, and thank you for raising that. I think it's not a matter of ratings and methodologies, and IFAD is is very seriously trying to raise the bar in achieving better results on the ground. And in the last few years, in the last couple of years, especially in IFAD 11, if you see, a whole transformation is taking place to our business model with all the decentralization, with greater attention not only to investment projects, but also to non-lending activities and policy dialogue as complementary interventions. So I think there is a conscious effort to try and raise the bar, and not only to report in a disaggregated way the results that we're achieving. So I think maybe my colleagues want to add a little bit more to that, but you should rest assured it's not only a methodological issue, but it's much more than that.
Thank you. I want to go back to because I am looking at the watch, I want to go back to the ICOs to make sure that you guys don't have any questions for the panel. So we lost two. Yes, we lost Ulash and Esther. Okay. So Latin America, you guys are great. So do you have any questions for the panelists? Yes, go ahead, Peru.
No, he said no.
No, Peru said no. Okay. No. Else. Yeah, go. There you go. Leonardo, you have a question? No?
Yes, maybe a quick one. I see a lot of a discussion on targeting and also on design implementation. I was just wondering if there has been any work done on assessing the improvement of visibility of the general work of IFAD in terms of how it's much more visible now to our partners than before.
Thank you, Leonardo, because that was also something that Lisandro hinted on. So what have we done to raise the profile of IFAD at national level, at government level, country level?
If I may, I think we have done a lot, but I think Leonardo's point is, are we assessing that? We are assessing a lot of, and giving scores and ratings. Have we assessed how much progress we've made? Because I think it's evident for many of us that IFAD's visibility has increased substantially in the countries. So that it would be interesting to know, in the countries that it has increased a lot, what is it that IFAD has done to reach that? Because we have had a lot of discussions on policy engagement and what level of policy engagement IFAD is really working with. And I think what Sarah brought up earlier, making sure that we have dialogues at the national level, not just with ministries of agriculture, what is our one-to-one, or ministries of finance, but other ministries. Like in our case, for example, there are governments in Africa that have youth ministries, others that have gender ministries. So, of course, environment ministries are more somebody that we need. So we have to engage with them because we need them. But the fact that there are so many other ministries that are linked to our work, what is it that we are doing to ensure that they know about IFAD? And I think the question is very relevant because if I don't recall wrongly, some years ago, there was a statement in one of the ESA countries talking about the international community supporting this country, and IFAD was not named, for example. And when they analyzed the size of the portfolio, IFAD's portfolio was the largest, but nonetheless, on the front page, they talk about all the entities except for IFAD. Yeah. So I think that question from Leonardo is very relevant on what are we doing to really measure our progress in visibility.
Yes, thank you for that question. I think, with our flagship report, sort of the youth report, rural development report, this is becoming clearer and clearer, an analytical tool for IFAD. We have the opportunity to disseminate those findings at country level. So there we have multiple stakeholders coming in. We're working with WFP FAO. For instance, in the field and nutrition gap analysis at country level, we've already done 10 such policy briefs which are being produced. So just to complement what she's saying, so we are there presenting different analytical work with multiple stakeholders, and I think this has been very helpful in getting that. We are also working with Cape Town University to do climate vulnerability assessments around 10 countries in East and Southern Africa. And so when we partner with other actors, I think that also really helps because it opens up doors for where we might not have been so visible before. Sure. I was also reminded in Western Central Africa, they did a very big call for action around these two celebrities, Sherry Silver and another young gentleman. So that really also created a lot of momentum around youth and our youth action plan. I think those types of events and calls for action are very, also very impactful in positioning us. And just finally, I think governments know us well. So that's one thing. Our beneficiaries know us well on the ground. I think we can still do a little bit better in engaging with the private sector and getting their views and impressions and how they can participate more in our programs.
Yeah, there's always room for improvement. And as a communicator, you can definitely do better in communicating what you do. So that definitely is an area for improvement. Okay, thank you very much for this conversation. I know there were lots of more questions. I have committed Chitra to... Very good. So Chitra will take care and make sure that the questions are answered. Now, to close the panel, I have a question which may be a little bit controversial, but which is fine. So the ARI shows that IFAD is delivering bigger and smarter program of work with fewer budgeted resources. At the same time, though, it's showing that the completed projects are not better. So my final question to all of you is, from your respective vantage points, how can IFAD raise the quality of its projects with fewer resources? And what is the one thing that IFAD can do to fulfill this aspiration of the strategic framework of doing better? In other words, what is the silver bullet and what is the silver lining? Go ahead, Ashwani.
I don't think I have the silver bullet, but from my point of view, I think it is, and at entry, I think there's need for us to be a bit more discerning and to design projects which are more realistic and more customized to the country context. I still feel that we still have interventions which are very ambitious and not necessarily commensurate with the policy and institutional environment of the countries where we're working.
Thank you.
I don't think there is a silver bullet, I'm afraid. I would say two things, and I may contradict a little bit Ashwani, because I think some of our projects are wonderfully designed. They are beautiful. We could put them in a frame. Our problem is the implementation. So I would invest more time, money, and human resources in ensuring that we do proper implementation and that we do adaptive management. When we see things are not working, we adapt quickly and we change the road or the route we are taking to get to that end. And of course, I couldn't say we cannot make progress without taking into account women, youth, environment, climate, and nutrition aspects, as well as other social inclusion aspects that are key for IFAD's mandate. So all the social and environmental dimension of the development agenda in the rural areas are key.
Thank you, Margarita.
My budget does not allow me to use silver to cast bullets. I have to use much lower cost alloys. But I would say, I think I do agree that there is a need to improve the quality of design. Quality is still important. I think realism, commitment of the main partners is fundamental, as is implementation performance. So again, our projects are, in a way, most of them have an experimental character. Let's face it, are an experiment. And many of them do need to be updated, upgraded, or even changed during the implementation life. So we need to be able to be aggressive in attacking these implementation issues or change it in design as soon as possible. Free, and allow me, because I come from evaluation, we need also to learn from experience. And so design, certainly implementation, and follow-up as soon as possible. Learning from experience. There is a lot of experience that we have from projects. We need to systematize it and really learn from our very rich empirical experience we have in our portfolio.
Thank you.
Lastly, but not least, I fully agree. But I think, IFAD has had a long history in some of the countries that we operate in. And it's really, let's say, the challenge for the country directors to come in and align the programs that are taking place. And by alignment, I'd say, well, where you have 4 or 5 ongoing projects, you would then want to actually see how you can streamline that and have 3. Then you would actually have a little bit more space for your budget when you're looking at the key strategic things that you'd want to get. That's one. I think, secondly as well, we cannot underestimate the need for understanding of the context. And so when we go into design, we really need to be able to pull out those contextual issues that Ashwani is talking about to say, how are we really going to meet this? It's not only relevance, but it's really looking at how will we be able to implement this. And normally, if you can appraise a project that you have designed, then it gives you that additional confidence that there are structures, whether they're government or non-state actors, who are able to complement and implement what you have designed. But if you don't do that, then you don't have a very good idea of whether it's possible or not. So implementation strength for me is very, very important. And then, as I said before, I think we can invest more on M&E, and then we will be, forewarned or have real-time information on what is going on and where do we think we need to change it. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Now, we're lucky enough to have Donna Brown with us today, IFAD's Associate Vice President for Program Management Department. So, Donna, you heard the conversation. You heard the different points of view. And I would like to ask you to share your reflections with us and how, then, from where you sit, you're going to take all of this forward.
Thank you. I hope I'm not breaking too many protocols by not sitting at that desk. Because when I first got here, I realised how much there's tradition. If you're not when I try not to sit at that desk, I get pulled up. So I'm glad that, like the wonderful use of this room, I think there should be a prize for the most creative use of this room. I've never seen it like this. I think it's great. So I hope we got some pictures.
So make sure that you continue the tradition.
Excellent. So I think it's been a really, really useful conversation this afternoon, and I think it's, for many reasons, I think IOE have done a great job at trying to organise this event, but also I think in the challenges they put forward to management, and as those of you that at these sort of events regularly realise that there's 2 sides to every story, and you've heard some of the issues that management have with the ARI today, and I won't bother repeating them. But I think there are some very valid questions that the ARI raises, even if we are not in agreement with some of the conclusions all the time. But I think one of the things we also have to do, I think, is, as someone said this afternoon, we can design the best projects in the world, but actually it's how you implement them that's the important issue. Actually, design at one level is slightly theoretical, because we know that when you're on the ground, when you have to respond to real life situations in any walk of life, you've got to be able to adapt and be flexible. And I think that's a lesson we're all learning, and we need to continue to learn. And I think the second point I'll probably make is that it's we can get a bit caught up on some of the data and some of these performance issues, but performance, the real important issue is the impact and results. And in that context, what IFAD is doing, as the impact evaluation has shown, is we are generally producing some really, really good results and impact. Performance is in many ways about how we try and get those results, but I think there's no denying that we're getting the results. The second thing I think that's quite important, and I say it on a regular basis, is overall for IFAD, you need to take a much more nuanced approach. If you break down the sort of ratings that you see, actually many regions in IFAD are doing extremely well. but actually there's just one or two challenging regions, and particularly Lisandro's intervened a couple of times, but particularly WCA, Western Central Africa, is our most demanding region. If you took them out of the equation, we would be doing very, very well. But Lisandro's doing a really, really excellent job at addressing the issues. And that brings me on to my next point, which is actually, and one of the things that comes through strongly with the ARI, which I really agree with, is IFAD can only do so much. This is a partnership, and the other part of that partnership is the government. And for many of the performance parameters that are within IFAD's control, quality entry, mobilising, co-financing, quality supervision, we're actually doing fairly well. The challenge for us, and I think came out this afternoon, is to continue to strengthen that partnership with government. You know, the World Bank are interesting because the World Bank, for a lot of these other results that are far more dependent on government, they call them World Bank supported results. And, you know, because only so much is within your own control. And we need to, you know, the ARI highlights it. We have regular discussions with Oscar and his team about what more we can be doing to strengthen government's capacity. But it's not as easy as it sounds, because what we also know is we have lots of programs strengthening capacity of PMUs, monitoring evaluation, you name it. But these people, as soon as you train them, often get poached by the World Bank or others. So we're strengthening capacity at one level. How do you retain that capacity? You know, the some of the things you've tried to put in place, like the fast implementation startup for projects, is one way we're trying to do it. Because what you get, you know, in human nature, as you come towards the end of an employment time on a project and you know it's closing, you're going to look for your next job. So if they know that the next phase is going to be starting and we have a way of sort of forward financing that phase, it means we can retain some of the specialist skills we train and we keep up. So, you know, there's a lot more we can do in that context. But I wouldn't underestimate, you know, that I think the biggest challenge that we face and that we continue to work on is how we can strengthen and work alongside government. And part of this is also about the projects are not an end to themselves. If we can really get into governments and influence policy, work with them on policy and outcomes, and get that understanding of why the projects deliver certain outcomes and these key things, we can make a big difference. I mean, one really interesting thing here is there is no real link between countries in fragile situations and project performance. So context, you know, just because it may be a country in fragile context does not mean you're going to have weaker projects. It's very much down to the implementation side of things there, because a lot of people will say, oh, you get weaker projects because it's a weak country. That's not the case. It's very much about that side of things. Sarah, I think, did a really good job at outlining many of the things we're doing. I think, just to re-emphasize a few, firstly, you know, the ARI is useful, but the ARI is projects that completed. I can't do anything about those. What I need to know is what's happening on the current portfolio and how can I influence those, which is why we're putting so much more emphasis not only on the RIDE as our reporting mechanism, but on real-time data coming out of those projects. So my teams know that I have a AVP dashboard which I put around the whole place. You can go to any totem round here and you can see exactly how the live performance is coming from our data systems. Now, there's two things. If performance is not good, I sometimes get a response, yeah, but the data's not right. So I'm saying, well, but the data's on the data I see is what you put in, so fix it. Or there is an issue here and let's work through it. And having that much earlier early warning of what's going on and where we need to focus, and then responding on data rather than on what we think, is something that, you know, that I think is really, really helping. We've got a way to go, but I think that's really helping. And making sure everyone is using data for decision making rather than what they think, and that live data. The second thing is, I think then decentralization is really helping. We need to go further. We know that. I think, hopefully, he says, you'll see the budget for 2020 continues to reinforce the need. You know, we've got a certain way, but we know there's a few gaps and things at country level, at regional level, that need to be filled, and we need to sort of fine-tune that. But I think decentralization is really helping, both getting PMD staff nearer to the projects, but also SKD and FMD staff. So getting all our staff nearer to projects. And the other flip side of it, and we've done it for the first time this year, is flipping the whole budgeting and planning process. So we're actually starting the budgeting and planning process from the hubs. I don't sit there and ask my regional directors to do it. We go to the hubs, and I'm not talking about PMD. We're going to the hubs and the cross-EFAD teams in the hubs and saying, you need to create your plans and your budgets accordingly, and we'll work those upwards. So it starts that level. It's work in progress. We've got to do more. But I think that will really help as well. And it comes back to these resources issues. We can have a real conversation. But, there's an onus on EFAD with the resources too, to be much better at tracking the resources. So at hub level, the resources get allocated to different projects and programs, but inevitably we need that flexibility. Things get moved around about. So we need to be able to say exactly how the money's spent on what, and we need to get better at tracking it too, and we're doing that. So just lastly, maybe, I think we're going to continue to work on this quality issue. And as I said at the last executive board, it's not a quick fix. I don't think we're doing badly on quality and performance, but we can do a lot better. And it's going to be a 1 to 3 year time frame, really, to get there, nearer the 3 side of things. What I really appreciate from IOE as we go forward, with their vast experience and knowledge, is that they can continue to try and strengthen their recommendations and make them more and more concrete and practical for us, particularly around the area of improving government's performance on efficiency and sustainability, something that we both agree needs to be there. So for example, if the ARI recommends building capacities of government counterparts, well, we do that day and night, week in and week out. So what more is it we need to be doing? We can all agree we need to do that, but we need more specificity. And that's where I get back down to, start deconstructing these on a regional basis. Tell us what that means in WCA, because it's very different to APR. And having those sort of recommendations and discussions will really, really help us. And I think that's the way we need to go going forward, is be much more specific and be much more focused on a regional context basis, because things are quite different in the different regions. And that would be really, really helpful. And lastly, I thought, and I'm very grateful to Oscar and the evaluation committee for the peer review process. I think that raised a number of really, really good questions about how we can overall improve the evaluation function in EFAD. And if we really properly implement those, I think it will really help with the whole quality issue more generally.
Thank you, Donald. That was very positive, and I'm sure that, everybody in the room has heard it, so now everybody will follow and make sure that, we get where we need to be. So, Oscar, to you, closing remarks.
Thank you. I would like to really thank all of you for your participation, active participation through the Mentimeter and your engaged listening and words. I would like to take a broader, perhaps historical perspective about what we have seen today, because this type of engagements, this type of learning events for us are increasingly important part of what an evaluation function should do. In addition to providing the evidence about the performance and identifying the factors that led to performance in any of the dimensions that we are evaluating, it is for these moments of reflection that we produce this type of exercises. And therefore, I'm extremely thankful to all of you for participating tonight. And indeed, we are concerned with the quality. And it's a common concern that we share with management. What do we do, right, to improve the quality? And Lisandro was telling that it is important to keep a client perspective onto that, and I cannot agree more. And of course, when we speak about the client perspective, we start by effectiveness. The client is borrowing money from EFAD, and they would expect that our effectiveness is at the top notch and that our objectives are being fulfilled. Nowadays, we see that 75% of our projects have been performing satisfactorily or better, which is good, but we are kind of flat on 75. That means that 1 in 4 projects does not get it where we want to get. 3 do, which is a very positive story, but 1 does not. And therefore, I think it's important for us to reflect collectively, how can we do to bring that 4th project also to achieve its objectives? And we have identified in our architecture the number of issues that need to be addressed. In this relationship between IOE and IFAD management, I think we have made very good progress. And I would like to quote 4 examples that we have been mentioned today. The first one was mentioned by Margarita when she said that the policies instituted in IFAD to strengthen our approach to natural resource management and climate change are yielding fruits, right? And those include the establishment of a division like the ECD, as well as the policies and the SECAP, and transitioning from not doing harm to doing good is yielding results. And I think that that's a very good way of expressing the collaboration in which IOE paid attention to what are we doing as an institution to address the important dimensions of natural resource management for smallholder farmers and agriculture. The second example was related to the targeting guidelines. As you know, the previous year, ARI have been insisting on the importance of targeting well because it is strongly correlated with stronger performance on effectiveness. And therefore, we are very pleased that the board has approved this year in September the targeting guidelines with a much more specific approach on how can we do that context specifically to respond to the needs of our client and member states. The third example is the restructuring policies, that we cannot wait until the end of a project to really change course and do course correction to achieve the objectives. And the fourth example is the quick implementation facility that has been implemented. We have identified that a delay in starting our projects for up to 2 years inevitably hinder the effectiveness of results. That average has reduced significantly now, but this facility is a concrete response to what IOE has been identifying in a number of evaluations at the project level. And therefore, I think this dialogue is extremely fruitful. Now we are talking about relevance and how to improve the relevance of our operations. And I am extremely grateful to our panelists because they have, on one hand, brought our attention to the importance of the outcome level, as Sarah put it. We need to really get deeper into our dialogue with governments on nutrition, on income, on jobs, on adaptation to climate change. Those are the issues that are really of concern to our governments, that we will really yield the best of what IFAD can do. But in addition to that, I think we all benefited from the 4 silver bullets that we got out of the debate from them. We need to ensure that quality and entry produce more realistic projects, more customized, where Ashwani's words, right, in terms of understanding the national needs, capacities, and constraints, that the implementation is important, and that for that adaptive management is really key. And I'm glad to hear that the AVP PMD, Donald Brown, really pays important attention to the data that is coming from the operations through the dashboards and really strengthening our capacity to monitor those results. We have heard from Fabrizio that it's important to learn from experience, right, and therefore really absorb the lessons that are coming from this type of exercises. And finally, from Sarah, the importance of aligning to country needs, right, being really responsive to these country needs. These are really very nice, although you don't believe in silver bullets, we have ammunition here to try to improve the performance of our operations. And I want to thank all of you once again for your participation in this learning event. Thank you, Roxy.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. You were really good. Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Same here. Same here. Thank you.